Good afternoon, everybody. Ronnie is right. We have this unusual relationship. I resent him. First of all, he's success in business. Then he's successful in the world of finance. Then he writes more brilliant articles than I do. Then he speaks more eloquently than I do. Then everybody in the world knows Ronnie. So Ronnie, someday I hope to catch up with you, So, so anyway, it's a real pleasure to be back here. I'm an old friend of the Asia Society. I don't know how many times I've spoken at the Asia Society in New York. And I also am happy to see so many old friends here. And I hope that what I'm about to say to you is of some use to you, because as Ronnie said, ASEAN may actually prove to be create a second window for Hong Kong. I mean, as you know, Hong Kong is blessed. You are sitting right next to the world's fastest growing economy, and the economy will become number one in the world. But what is little known is that by 2050, ASEAN will be the fourth largest economy in the world. And so that creates a tremendous opportunities. It's already the seventh largest economy, and it's on its way to becoming the fourth largest economy. So that clearly creates opportunities. But for Hong Kong to engage ASEAN, it's important to understand the nature of the beast. Because ASEAN is a very unique beast, if you read about ASEAN in the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or the Financial Times, you get it all wrong. They don't understand it wrong. Because when they see ASEAN moving, I always say ASEAN moves like a crab, It takes 2 steps forward, 1 step backwards, 1 step sidewards. And ASEAN always seems to be going in circles. But yet, if you slice ASEAN decade by decade, look at the size of the ASEAN GNP 1970, 1980, 1990, 2000, 2010. It keeps rising. So clearly ASEAN is doing something right. So what I hope to do, and what my co-author and I hope to do with this book that I'm so glad that many of you have already bought, to explain the nature of the beast. And this is what I propose to do in my remarks. I gather I have Ronnie to 2:45, right? And then, 1:45, sorry. I told him Castro spoke for 5 hours. Why can't I speak for 3 hours? No, but I'll be brief. What I would like to do is to give you an insight into the core being of ASEAN. And I'll do it by answering 5 questions. First question is, why ASEAN should have failed? Second, why instead of failing it succeeded? Third, what benefits did ASEAN success deliver? Fourth question, what dangers does ASEAN face? And finally, what should ASEAN do about them? Now, that's a lot of ground to cover in 20 minutes, so you might get some bullet points thrown at you, but hopefully you will end up with a feeling of what ASEAN is about. Now, what makes ASEAN really special is that by the way, in roughly 3 weeks' time, on August 8, 2017, ASEAN will be celebrating its 50th anniversary. Now that's a real miracle, because when it was founded in 1967, no one expected ASEAN to survive more than 2 or 3 years. Its 2 predecessors, Asa and Mafilindo, died within 2 years. And at that time, the region was in great turmoil. There was all kinds of conflicts. We know about the Vietnam War that was happening, the confrontasi between Indonesia and Malaysia, Singapore split from Malaysia, the Philippines claim on Sabah. And so there were all kinds of problems in the region. And clearly, I think many of you are probably too young to know this, but in the 1960s, Southeast Asia looked as hopeless as the Middle East does today. I mean, you have Yemen, you have Iraq, you have Syria, and then you also have this unusual Qatar problem, right? So that's what Southeast Asia looked like in the 1960s. And then to make matters even worse, if you were to travel around the world, go anywhere, go to Latin America, go to Africa, go to South Asia, go to Europe, go anywhere, to find the most difficult region to do regional cooperation, that region will be Southeast Asia. And you know why? Today, out of 600 million people in Southeast Asia, there are 240 million Muslims, 120 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, and you have Taoists, you have Confucianists, you have Hindus. Now, there's no other region of planet Earth is as diverse as Southeast Asia. So it provides the most inhospitable grounds for regional cooperation, and that's what makes ASEAN so amazing, and that's why everyone thought that ASEAN would fail. So the second question is, why did ASEAN succeed? Now, to make it easy to understand, what we do in the book is to say that ASEAN succeeded because of a few four-letter words. And the first four-letter word, of course, begins with F. Any guesses? Anybody? I'll say it quickly. It's F-E-A-R, fear. And it's important to understand, as I mentioned, the region was in conflict, the Cold War was still on, and the 5 ASEAN countries who started it, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, Philippines, Thailand, felt threatened by the Cold War. And in fact, they were supposed to be dominoes waiting to fall in the 1960s. So it was fear that drove them together. But the second four-letter word is luck. And here, ASEAN was in some ways very lucky for 2 reasons. One is that the geopolitical alignment worked in ASEAN's favor. So the United States supported ASEAN very strongly. And in fact, when ASEAN was founded, and this is the paradox when I come to today's world, when ASEAN was founded in 1967, it was seen as a pro-American creation, and China condemned ASEAN. Said, this is an American neo-imperialist plot, right? That was in 1967. But United States support helped. And the other reason why ASEAN was lucky is that it had, at a critical period, unusually strong leaders, and strong leaders who were in office a long time. And I'll mention a few. One is, of course, President Suharto of Indonesia. And in Indonesia's role, by the way, is very critical. Many regional organizations, like in South Asia, like in Organization of American States, don't succeed because the largest country tries to dominate the regional organization. Indonesia did the exact opposite and said, we will let others take the lead in ASEAN. And that was a wise move on the part of President Suharto. And then you had, of course, Lee Kuan Yew. And what's remarkable is that, if there are 2 men whose worldviews are the most different, they are Lee Kuan Yew, who had a completely Anglo-Saxon, legally trained mind, and President Suharto, who had a traditional Javanese mind. And the Javanese are very complex, subtle people. So, like for example, when they say yes to you, they smile like this. And when they say no to you, they smile at you like this. Can you spot the difference? You see? I mean, it's amazing. The worlds are so different. And yet, these 2 minds could connect. And that's what makes ASEAN so special. Different cultures, different civilizations connecting together. That were the leaders. And then the third 4-letter word, which none of you will guess, begins with G. It is GOLF, golf. Now you may not believe this, but many serious problems within the ASEAN countries were solved on the golf course. And I experienced this myself because I used to lead the Singapore delegation for the senior officials meetings. And quite often, you would propose something, there would be an argument, I think I may even give an example in the book when Singapore proposed the idea of an Asia-Europe meeting. I think Malaysia wasn't happy initially, so we couldn't get agreement, but I played golf with my Malaysian counterpart, a tall guy, Tan Sri Kamil Jaafar. And after the golf, we had a few beers, and I said, Kamil, I said to him in Malay, tolong, help me lah. I can't get my promotion until you agree. And he did. I mean, it's a true story. He helped me out after that golf game. So there's story after story like this. And I remember golf games with Gareth Evans, who played with Ali Alatas, with Abdullah Badawi, who then became Prime Minister of Malaysia. And you could see the camaraderie develop in the golf course. So you can just imagine if North Koreans and South Koreans can play golf with each other, what a different world it would be. But anyway, that's actually, even though I'm making a jest, I'm joking about it, I want you to know that that's a serious point. Now quickly, then the third point is, what benefits has ASEAN delivered? And here, ASEAN has, if you look at it objectively, the reason why we closed the book with a very strong recommendation that ASEAN get the Nobel Peace Prize this year is because ASEAN has delivered real, concrete benefits to many people. Number one, it has produced peace. Now, everyone takes peace for granted, right? But actually, getting peace in the most diverse region of planet Earth is a fantastic achievement. Of course, we haven't reached the European Union's gold standard. And what's the European Union's gold standard? In the European Union, you don't just have zero wars, you also have zero prospect of war. Germany and France will never go to war with one another. UK and France will never go to war with one another. That's amazing. They've been fighting for centuries. That's the gold standard. Now, ASEAN has only achieved zero wars, hasn't yet achieved zero prospect of war, but it is getting there. And therefore, is the second most promising region in this area. But it has not just brought peace within ASEAN. ASEAN has created a culture that is now seeping into other parts of East Asia also. And I can tell you, for example, when there were times when Sino-Japanese relations, as you know, from time to time, China-Japanese relations go down. Boom. Then they got to figure out a face-saving way of meeting each other. They can't have a bilateral meeting because you have the meeting in Japan or you have a meeting in China. Very difficult diplomatically. So what happens? China and Japan come to an ASEAN meeting. And while they're at ASEAN meeting, they have breakfast. And then they talk. So in this way, ASEAN has facilitated so many encounters and spread a culture of peace, not just in Southeast Asia, but across East Asia also. And this is something that is completely under-recognized. And I can tell you, just last week, I think, the Indian Foreign Secretary, Jaishankar is his name, brilliant guy, spoke at the Lee Kuan Yew School. And he said in his speech, because his speech was about India and ASEAN, he said when India decided to turn, as you know, at the end of the Cold War, India turned, opened up, liberalized its economy, and India wanted to engage East Asia. He said, for us, fortunately, ASEAN opened the doors for India. And when ASEAN opened the doors, India could walk in, and India integrated itself. So that alone is a huge achievement. The second most populous country in the world getting engaged with East Asia through ASEAN. And what's amazing is till today, the Indian leaders remember this, how ASEAN helped them. That's another example. And of course, ASEAN has produced remarkable prosperity. I already told you how ASEAN has been growing decade by decade. But the track record of ASEAN is quite amazing. And what's impressive is that ASEAN has been able to facilitate the economic development, not just of its original founding members. As you know, originally we started with 5. Now in the 1990s, 5 more joined. Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam joined. And I believe that as a result of joining ASEAN, the new members also did well. And let me quote to you what President Jim Yong Kim, the president of World Bank, said on February 23rd last year, 2016. Quote, Vietnam's development achievements over the past 25 years are remarkable. Over this period, the lives of the Vietnamese people have changed dramatically. We have seen economic growth averaging nearly 7%, which enabled Vietnam, one of the world's poorest countries in the 1980s, to leapfrog the middle income status in a single generation. In an especially remarkable achievement, Vietnam has reduced extreme poverty from 50% about 25 years ago to just 3% today. Now that's one of the most remarkable human development stories of our times, and it also happened partly because Vietnam was a member of ASEAN and could join the cooperative frameworks. So you can see Vietnam has improved the lives of many. But at the same time though, and this is my fourth point, ASEAN faces some serious dangers now, and that's also why I wrote the book now. And the two big dangers that ASEAN faces now. The first big danger is geopolitical. Now, ASEAN was very fortunate that in the 80s and 1990s even, in general, US and China were working together. But as you know, when the world's number 2 power, China, is about to overtake the world's number 1 power, you can anticipate growing rivalry between the two. Now, when that rivalry happens, the region that is the most vulnerable to US-China geopolitical rivalry is Southeast Asia. And in fact, the one key message we give in the book is, in fact, it's a message we make to Beijing. We say, whatever you do in your geopolitical competition with the United States, please treat ASEAN like a Ming vase. It's very delicate. Took 50 years to build. Once it cracks, you can't put it together again. So that's one of the core messages of this book. And the same message also to Washington, D.C. You may have your rivalry with China. Whatever you do with the rivalry, don't use ASEAN as part of the contest between US and China. And that's one of the core reasons why we wrote this book now, to remind all the great powers how useful it is to have ASEAN. And of course, the second challenge that ASEAN faces is that its leaders, and this in some ways is what you call a prize of success. ASEAN has succeeded, it has developed middle-class populations, the political systems have become more democratic. As the political systems become more democratic, the leaders become internally focused. They are focused on winning elections and not focused on foreign policy issues. So, for example, Prime Minister Najib is, of course, focused on the next elections. I'm sure President Jokowi is thinking about the next elections. Every Singapore is thinking about the next election. And Thailand, as you know, is going through a very unique challenge in managing its political transition. So all these countries have become domestically focused. So if they become domestically focused, they don't have time to pay attention to ASEAN. So that's another danger that it faces. So let me conclude by asking, what can ASEAN do in some ways, especially to strengthen itself so that it's stronger in dealing with these challenges. So we end the book with 3 suggestions. The first suggestion is to build a greater sense of ownership of ASEAN among the people of the region. Now, one fact I didn't get a chance to mention to you is that ASEAN has been up to now very much what they call a G2G project, government to government project. So the governments are cooperating very well, the populations are benefiting, but they're not aware of ASEAN. In fact, knowledge about ASEAN is actually very poor among the ASEAN peoples. And by the way, that's why I'm very glad that the Lee Foundation in Singapore gave us a grant to have this book translated into every ASEAN language. It may well be the first book to be translated into Thai, Bahasa Melayu, Bahasa Indonesia, Myanmar, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnamese, and Tagalog. I think I didn't mention it. So 8 languages it will be translated into. And that's very important for us. Getting this book out to the ASEAN people was a very important part of this exercise. And that's one thing. And by the way, if you don't create a sense of ownership, you want to understand the danger, look at Brexit, right? Everybody was bashing EU, the politicians, and the net result is that the people didn't seem to take ownership of EU, and you had Brexit as a result. So that's why people's ownership of regional cooperation is very important. The second suggestion we make is to strengthen the ASEAN Secretariat. You know, I compared the ASEAN earlier to the European Union, which, by the way, is still the number 1 in terms of regional cooperation. ASEAN is number 2. What's interesting is that if you add up all the EU GNPs and all the ASEAN GNPs, the size of the combined European Union GNP is 6 times the size of ASEAN. So EU is still much bigger, 6 times. But you know, the budget for the EU Secretariat, EU Commission, is 8,000 times larger than the ASEAN Secretariat budget. That shows you how tiny the ASEAN Secretariat budget is. So clearly, we say, please, spend more money on the Secretariat. Try and strengthen it, because it's a good investment to make for a regional organization. And the final suggestion we have, and this is especially in our world of today, because we know, as you know, it's not a secret, we live in a world today where there's a lot of doom and gloom. And especially after all the terrorist incidents that have been happening in Europe, in America, people have a feeling, let's say, Islam and Christianity cannot get along with each other. They're bound to clash. We live in a world where there's a fear of clash of civilizations is growing. Now, if you want to handle this problem of clash of civilizations, you need to find a living laboratory in the world that demonstrates that civilizations which are different can work together. And there is only one laboratory on an entire planet Earth which shows you that different civilizations can work together, and that laboratory is ASEAN. So if you can tell the rest of the world that they too have a stake in the success of ASEAN, because if ASEAN succeeds, and ASEAN gives a living example of a multi-civilizational laboratory that can work harmoniously and peacefully, it brings hope to all of us in this world. And therefore, this is a miracle, and I hope that Hong Kong will engage ASEAN even more. Thank you very much.
Okay, couple of questions. What happened when I don't play golf? Maybe that's why I have not achieved my maximum potential. But maybe I'll learn golf sometime. But anyway, we do have a lot of Consul General here I purposely did not recognize them one by one because I'm afraid that I may miss some of them. So, for example, I know that at least in my table you have Brunei here, Vietnam, and Myanmar, and so forth, and of course Belgium. But Belgium is not exactly part of ASEAN, but anyway, part of EU, and indeed where the head office is. Can you say something about? To my knowledge, ASEAN countries have spoken or unspoken rules to not meddle in each other's affairs.
Yes.
Is that something breaking down? Is that something that may become another challenge to the ASEAN moving forward? That some people, perhaps for domestic politics or external pressure from such as the West, to meddle in each other's affairs? Is that a danger?
Well, I think what you will find is that ASEAN has got a very unique way of solving problems, you know. And one of the best examples we give in the book to describe how the ASEAN method works, let's take two countries that have had military governments for a long time. It's a fact. One was Syria, the other was Myanmar. Now the West took care of Syria. How did the West take care of Syria? Through sanctions, through isolation, through bombing. And Syria today is a mess. And ASEAN took care of Myanmar by welcoming Myanmar as a member, by engagement, and by constant dialogue. Right? Today, Myanmar is making a very peaceful transition. And I can tell you, this is a fact, okay? When ASEAN admitted Myanmar, the EU cut off ties with ASEAN, saying, how can you admit Myanmar? It's a big mistake. Today, you see who made the mistake. And that's an example. In the last chapter of the book, you'll find some amazing stories that the former foreign minister of Singapore, who now lives in Hong Kong, Giorgio, told me. And he says, there were some instances, you remember at one point in time, because of Cyclone Nargis, people were dying in Myanmar. Myanmar refused international assistance. And at that time, actually, the French, Bernard Kouchner, dangerously suggested, we'll have military intervention in Myanmar. But ASEAN said that's wrong. Instead, ASEAN spoke to the ministers in Myanmar, and Myanmar opened its doors to international assistance. So there are many areas of where ASEAN has delivered concrete results that have benefited the lives of hundreds of thousands. And this is through a very delicate process. You do, in a sense, you do interfere, but you do it carefully and through dialogue, and not through imposing sanctions and trying to sort of browbeat other countries into submission.
Most honorable, and I think I agree with you, it really works well. But what do you do with, I'm sorry, Michel, the Consul General from Belgium sitting here, what do you do with the West, which is still the most powerful, be it the United States together with EU, that they have a monotheistic tradition, and their civilization is such that, it's either God or the devil, salvation or perdition, heaven and hell, everything is black and white. So if I am convinced that I am right, then I am the embodiment and incarnation of righteousness, and everybody else who does not agree with me is no good. And hence you have to, there's no compromise possible between God and Satan. So what do you do with Western civilization? And they still are the most dominant. And ASEAN, great example, success story, but are you sufficient to tilt the scale and get the Westerners to perhaps respect ASEAN a little bit more as they perhaps should?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to give you a secret, okay? Don't tell anybody. The West is no longer as dominant as it used to be. I tell you, in my next book, I'm submitting to hopefully to London in a couple of weeks' time. You see this amazing chart, which I wish I could show. In 1980, it's not so far away, the US share of the global GNP was here, Europe's share was here, India was here, China was here. I'm not exact. 1980. You know, these are you will see this. You can Google and get these charts. Right? Already now, in PPP terms, China is number 1. Right? US is number 2. India is number 3. See? So it's growing. And then by 2050, China and India's share will be up here, and EU and America will be here. Now that's a remarkable transformation, you know. So the share of global GNP that the West used to have at its peak at 1950 will naturally go down only because the Asians who used to underperform, and I've spoken about this at so many Asian societies meetings, have now stopped underperforming. And so the chemistry is changing. So now actually what I find when I travel and I go to the West, for example, I find a greater willingness to listen to different voices. And so, for example, the EU now does actually study what ASEAN has done with Myanmar and try to figure out why did ASEAN succeed with Myanmar. So that the minds are opening now.
Yeah, but that said, on a per capita basis, of course you can measure it whichever way and make you look good. But if you look at it, the absolute dollar terms, I mean, America and EU together still leave us in the dust. And much of the rise of Asia, if not on a PPP basis, was due to China, that's all. And China being too big has its own problems. And it cannot be that good of an example to the rest of the world. And militarily and politically, still the West dominates. Give you one example. The United States have not been paying United Nations dues for a long time, and you know it well because you were the ambassador from Singapore to the United Nations. And anybody dare to kick them out? Nobody dare to kick them out. If Singapore or even China try to not pay UN dues, there will be consequences. But America, no big deal. I spent a whole afternoon trying to convince Mitch McConnell and his wife, Elaine Chao, to please pay the UN due. This is 10, 15 years ago. I failed utterly. So what do? I mean, and militarily, they're still the most powerful. They control the Malacca Strait, among other things, all the choke points in the world, the Gulf of Hormuz, El Mandab Strait, and all that is still, and militarily, China is nowhere close to where the United States is. So what are you talking about, Kishore?
Yeah. Yeah, you know, since you said I used to be ambassador to the UN, I can tell you that I've studied this question of payments to the UN very carefully. And I've actually written about it too, and you will find it in my previous book, The Great Convergence. You know something? One of the most valuable seats in the world is to be a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Because, you know, there's only one body in the entire planet that can make decisions that are compulsory, that are mandatory and binding on nation states, and that's the UN Security Council. Now, in theory, the UN Security Council has got 15 members, 5 permanent members and 10 elected members. In reality, it has got 5 members and 10 observers. The 5 members control everything. Wait, let me finish. And so the one thing that the United States treasures is its permanent membership of the UN Security Council. So the United States has been playing this game of holding back dues to the UN for a long time, you're right. But they never let it fall beyond the point where they get automatically suspended. And they're very clever. And this is a factual. You can Google, you can check, you can read my writings.
Yeah, you're right.
They make sure that because there is an automatic mechanism in the UN. It's actually automatic. If you don't pay your dues for a certain percentage, you're automatically suspended. You lose your right to vote. And the United States doesn't want to lose its right to vote in the Security Council. So there are constraints even on the United States. It's a much more complex world, Ronnie.
What about militarily? What about militarily? I mean, there's nothing. For example, China would love to build a canal cut across from Thailand, as we all know. Been talking for decades. United States, Singapore doesn't like it. But if Singapore is the only one that doesn't like it, I'm sorry. It may happen. But the United States doesn't want it, it doesn't happen. So a lot of these things that the West is still the most powerful, in particular the United States?
Well, I mean,
And if they
frankly,
see everything black and white.
you know something that I give you a simple test, okay? As someone who was in diplomacy for 33 years, when you serve as an ambassador, when you arrive in a capital, and all diplomats can tell you this, there's a natural hierarchy. Now, I can tell you, in the 1970s and 1980s, doesn't matter which ASEAN country, in most of the ASEAN countries, the American ambassador was number one.
Of course.
And the Chinese ambassador maybe number 6, number 7, whatever it is, right? Now I'm going to give away a big secret again, okay? Today, in quite a few ASEAN countries, I will not mention names, okay? The American ambassador is no longer number one. And he's aware of it, by the way. He or she, sorry. And the Chinese ambassador has become number one. And power is sometimes tangible, but equally importantly is intangible. And it's what people perceive it to be. And you can see palpably the power of China rising. And so in terms of access, in terms of what gets done, things are changing. But it's important to emphasize that it is a big mistake for any of us to use historical examples, let's say even of the past 200 years, to understand what is happening today, because we are seeing a scale of change that we have never before seen in human history. Now, in this era of unprecedented change, none of the examples from the past enable you to understand the world of today. And just to give you one figure that will indicate to you the scale of the change, take the size of the global middle class population. In 2010, it was 1.8 billion. 2020, 3.2 billion. That's 3 years from now. 2030, 4.9 billion. Now, which means by 2030, more than half the world's population is going to enjoy middle-class living standards. Now, this has never before ever happened in the history of humanity. So it's a different world. And it creates completely different calculations. So, for example, as you know, a lot of power also comes from market power. So if you're looking for markets for your products and where you're going to sell them, guess what? You come to here, Asia. So there are all kinds of fundamental changes happening, that the old model of the West being dominant and controlling, and the Western power, I must emphasize, is not going to disappear. In fact, we want the West to remain very strong. But the kind of dominance that the West used to have is seeping away like air from a leaking balloon, bit by bit, every day. And that change is happening.
I think that perhaps that's taking place in EU, but I think the United States is still by far the most powerful. I think that the middle class number you use were basically from two countries, China and then India. And there is perception, power being perception, that's good, but that can dissipate overnight. What really counts is your military power and your science and technology power. And there, I think the United States is unmatched. But anyway, we better open to the floor. Student at the back, can you tell us which university you're from? Hong Kong, you.
I'm doing a master's in international relations.
Wonderful.
So I just want to follow up on Ronnie's question, actually, about the West being dominating and how it's black and white. I have to disagree with that because I think China itself is black and white in its domestic arena. And to them, there's no compromises. It's even worse domestically. But my question is, I think it's inevitable that the Western is retreating from Asia with China rising. But China's filling that vacuum, though. It's not as if ASEAN will fill in that vacuum, right? That power vacuum is also going to be filled up by China. So with Myanmar, you can see that China's actually hosting and getting very involved in the peace talks. and it funds some of the insurgency groups up in the north. So I don't think it's not a Western problem. It's a power problem. So yes, the West might leave one day or retreat, but then you still have the issue with China. And so, do you think ASEAN is strong enough to counter that power and become more independent? Because at the moment, it's either relying on the U.S. or the West or China. So I think that vacuum is not going to be taken up by easily taken up by ASEAN countries. It will be taken up by China. So
Great
how
question.
does
What are we gonna do
ASEAN
with China?
counter that?
What are we going to do with China? That's the question.
Well, I think I think number one. Let me state some things are obvious. China's power is going to grow. That's unstoppable. As China becomes bigger and bigger in its GNP, China's power is grown enormously in the last 30 years. I have seen China's power grow like this, and it will continue growing. But China will not be the only actor on the scene. The United States will remain. Its influence is diminishing. I mean, it's a fact. But it is still a strong and credible player in the region. But there are other actors in the region. You notice I spoke about the return not just of China, but China and India. And India will have, according to PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, the second largest economy in the world, ahead of United States by 2050. So it's a different world. And we see, but we've never handled this kind of multipolar world for centuries. So we have no working, living model that we can refer to. So it will not be just, in fact, I always say, it will not be the Chinese century, it will be the Asian century. And there'll be many, many successful societies in Asia. And one useful fact you should know is that ASEAN's middle class today, our population is half that of India's. Our middle class population is bigger than India's. So that is not so simple as you make it out to be. So it will not be a China-dominated world. And I don't think China itself necessarily wants a China-dominated world. I actually was in Davos this year, and I heard President Xi Jinping speak. I was in the room when he spoke. And the vision he gave in Davos was a very appealing vision, because he says we now live in a small interdependent world. We both have to understand each other, and we all have to learn to live with one another, right? So if you read Xi Jinping's speech, he's not trying to, China by its nature doesn't seem to have the same kind of global ambitions that the United States had for a long time. So it's a very different kind of great power. And the difference between United States and China is that the United States has got to deal with two dangerous neighbors. One is called Canada, and the other is called Mexico. China has to deal with not so dangerous neighbors. Korean Peninsula, Japan, Russia, India,
Vietnam.
China has a very different geostrategic environment from the United States. So for China, keeping peace with its neighbors is already a big challenge. So for them to undertake a global ambitions of the kind that the United States had, and this goes back to your earlier point, that it's all about mindset. I mean, the Americans actually believe that they could save the world. I mean, whether or not they did so is a different matter, but they actually believed it, right? I don't think the Chinese believe that they can save the world. I mean, that's my sense of them.
You're right. I was interviewed by Kevin Rudd in front of the White House 3 years ago. And I said that China is very happy to play second fiddle to the United States. It's too bad that the United States doesn't want to have anybody close to it. And the ambassador from China was sitting in the front row, and afterwards he got up and said, we long ago learned that we don't want to be number one because it's too expensive. And I thought to myself, yeah, also I don't think you qualify also. But anyway, but that said, the master will go on to say, well, it's best to be number 3 or number 4. But one day we got up and then we found out that we were number 2. And we found out that that was a very dangerous position because number 1 will slap you on the right when you turn right and slap you on the left when you turn left. So number 2 is a very uncomfortable position to be in. And so they do check one another. Okay, there was a question, in front. And then Andrew.
I'm To Han Shi, a Singaporean living in Hong Kong. Can you candidly tell us how much debate and differences of opinion are allowed within the Singapore diplomatic corps vis-a-vis issues like the rise of China? Right now, the Singapore Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong compared to Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong and compared to Lee Kuan Yew when he was Singapore Prime Minister?
I think he knows exactly. You may not know this, but he's referring to a debate that broke out in Singapore when I wrote an article about the role of small states. I think that's, and as you know, there was a very strong reaction from some of my former colleagues in the foreign ministry. And initially, I must confess, I was a bit shocked by the ferocity of the reaction. But the ferocity of the reaction actually led to a very interesting debate emerging in Singapore. And I've actually become very hopeful and optimistic that in the Singapore context, the what they call the OB markers have been widened for debate on these issues.
What's OB?
Oh yeah, okay. You don't play golf lah.
I'm sorry.
OB means out of bounds.
Oh, I'm sorry.
And
Singaporeans
when
are
you play
great with
golf, as you
acronyms.
know, if you hit outside the OB markers, your ball is disqualified. So
Poor guys,
I'm-
poor
I
Terry,
thought-
we don't play golf.
So anyway, I think the OB markers are widening in Singapore, and the debate is growing, and that's quite natural because Singapore, as you know, has a remarkably affluent society, very large middle class population. So as a result of that, the nature of the debate will also change in Singapore. So my
Andrew?
answer to you is I'm optimistic. Yeah.
Andrew?
Well, first of all, thank you very much indeed for sharing this wonderful insights with us. Like to follow up on the role of Singapore. I mean, inevitably, ASEAN will be increasingly intertwined with a more powerful China. And of course, ASEAN doesn't want to choose when push come to shove in the rivalry between China and the United States. So and Singapore, of course, has a unique role to play in ASEAN. But if we look at Singapore's recent relations with China, it's not redoubling. If anything, it is stalled, if not deteriorating. So my question is, what role Singapore would play and what a strategy would be on the rising China in balancing all these dynamics to strengthen the position of ASEAN in relation to a rising China?
And why were you not invited to the Belt and Road event a month ago in Beijing? Along that line?
Well, I think, one thing I learned, having been in international relations for a long time, is that international relations is never a smooth road. There are always bumps, ups and downs. I mean, for example, you mentioned Singapore-United States relations. I can tell you I was the permanent secretary of the foreign ministry at the time when Singapore decided to cane an American teenager, Michael Fay, in Singapore. And you saw how angry President Bill Clinton got after the event. So for a couple of years, our relations were a bit cold. Then they went back. So, it's all a question of diplomacy. So in the same way, we've had ups and downs with our relations with China. But at the recent G20 meeting in Hamburg 2 weeks ago, there was a meeting between President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. I mean, so clearly in diplomacy, you must assume that there are always ups and downs. And the question is always about how you manage these ups and downs. And Singapore has done a relatively good job of managing it. And I can tell you also that ASEAN is a huge asset in all this, because since now everybody wants to cultivate ASEAN. And one secret I didn't mention, and it's in our book in the section on ASEAN and the great powers, that today all the great powers in one way or another are courting ASEAN, quietly. And that makes ASEAN very valuable. right? If you look around the regional organizations around the world, you cannot find any other regional organization that is simultaneously being courted by all the great powers. And of course, the paradox here is that the strength of ASEAN comes from its weakness. Because it is a non-threatening body, it doesn't threaten everyone. Everyone trusts ASEAN. So then everyone wants to use ASEAN as the vehicle for engaging with the rest of the world. So for example, the fact that President Donald Trump is going to come for the East Asia Summit in Manila in November is a big deal. It's a sign, hey, I better come for an ASEAN meeting. Now, as you know, he gets all kinds of invitations to go everywhere. Where he chooses to travel is a statement of what's really important. And I guarantee you that all the great powers will come for that meeting. And that shows the importance of ASEAN.
Anybody else? No more? I wonder if I should ask the last one.
There's a lady.
There is? Oh, there's a lady? Where? Oh, yes. Sorry.
I just wanted to ask about growth in ASEAN, because I think it was in the intro that we all got about this event, about the growth of the economies in ASEAN. Because they're all very different economies. What do you think are the key things that are driving those economies in ASEAN?
Well, I think you're right. The ASEAN economies are very, very different. And incidentally, intra-ASEAN trade is only 25% of total ASEAN's trade with the whole world. But since ASEAN's trade with the whole world is going up like this, the 25% is going up like this too, logically. And so as a result of the ASEAN free trade area and other things like this, the barriers to intra-ASEAN trade are being diminished. And so there's a lot more growth happening. But the growth is happening not just inside ASEAN, but also between ASEAN and the rest of the world. For example, I don't have the figures offhand. If you look at ASEAN-China trade figures, there's something like this. The chart goes something like this, amazingly, because China was the first country to propose a free trade agreement to the ASEAN countries. So on the trade area, it's all a good news story on the part of the ASEAN countries. I think I have some statistics here or in the book that describes to you how fast the trade is growing. I'll just give you one example. ASEAN trade in goods among its member states in 7 years, between 2004 and 2011, doubled from 260 billion to 600 billion. That's one example.
10% growth per annum.
Huh?
There's a 10% growth per annum.
Yeah, and that's amazing.
Thank you very much. I wonder what... Oh, that's one more hand. We'll let that lady ask the last question.
Thank you. I'm Anne from Médecins Sans Frontières. So I have a question about ASEAN on global issues. Actually, I have to start to saying that, in October 2014, amid the global appeal to deal with the Ebola outbreak, Philippines said in a WHO meeting that it was considering deploying substantial numbers of health workers to West Africa because, quote, it's a responsibility to respond to that global call for assistance. I couldn't tell you how much I was moved by this when hearing this, when globally so few were willing to join hands to fight this epidemic. Could ASEAN play a bigger role in global issues by setting examples like this? Actually now, WHO's Emergency Medical Team initiative helps member states build capacity and coordinate the deployment of medical teams to assist other countries in emergencies, including in armed conflict situations. How to keep these medical teams safe? How to protect medical facilities, patients, personnel safe from attacks are major concerns. Do you think ASEAN can contribute to this protection of medical mission? Well, in what ways?
Well, I must confess to you that I often pretend to know everything, but I don't know everything.
Oh, that's a surprise.
And I must say I do not know what ASEAN does in the field of protecting medical missions, but I'm glad you referred to Philippines' contribution. But I do know that ASEAN countries make significant contributions to United Nations peacekeeping operations, PKOs. So if you travel in many parts of the world, you'll find Malaysians, Indonesians, Singaporeans participating in this peacekeeping operations. And as you know, one of the purposes of these peacekeeping operations is to create security and stability for humanitarian relief to take care of. So I suspect you may have to go to the UN website to get the answer. But it is also clear that as the ASEAN countries become more successful, they are doing more in terms of humanitarian assistance. And one example, as you know, in 2004, on Boxing Day, 2004, 26 December, you had the famous tsunami in Aceh, and the first responders on the ground, I think, if I'm not mistaken, came from Singapore to deal with the humanitarian crisis. So that's becoming now a kind of established tradition within the ASEAN countries. So I expect it, more and more of these things to happen, but I must confess to you, I cannot claim to be an expert in that area.
Just one anecdote. I was at the border of Lebanon and Israel one time, and the UN.
So you started the war.
The UN peacekeeping forces was mainly from the Philippines.
Yeah.
But that said, I think the biggest contributor of personnel to the UN peacekeeping, I believe, is now today China.
Yeah. In fact, China is the only permanent member of the UN Security Council, as of a few years ago, that contributed to troops for peacekeeping operations.
But one last question. What made you be so sure that France and Germany, for example, zero prospect for war? Are you sure?
Very simple. Ronnie, we'll settle it the old-fashioned way. Let's take a bet.
Instead of a bet,
I give you 10 to 1 odds.
Okay, very good. Next 50 years. Or whoever, one of us die until the first one dies, okay? But let's take a poll. How many of you think that in the next 50 years, there's no possibility for France and Germany to be at war? Okay, thank you. How many think that there's a possibility of France and Germany at war? You win. Ladies and gentlemen, I think Kishore is always worth listening to, always thoughtful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Oh, that's very nice. Thank you.